The street was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every step feel like it echoes through the shadows. Lamps flickered along the cracked sidewalks, casting uneven pools of light that seemed to hide more than they revealed. I watched from the corner of my eye as they drove by again, faces familiar, yet filled with the kind of disregard that burned hotter than the midday sun. Every glance, every whispered remark, carried a weight I had learned to carry silently. For weeks, months even, the patterns had repeated. Doors slammed when I walked past. Sidewalks cleared as I approached. Smiles that froze the moment my skin touched the same space as theirs. The world around me had grown loud with subtle hostility, and yet the most dangerous part wasn't the words. It was the calm confidence with which they assumed the right to make me feel invisible. I thought about leaving. About disappearing into a place where my presence wouldn't spark discomfort or fear. But leaving never solved anything. It only allowed injustice to flourish quietly in the spaces we abandon. That night, I decided enough was enough. I would no longer be a silent observer. I would reclaim the space that had been denied to me, not with rage, but with precision. Every move I made would challenge the assumptions, expose the arrogance, and reveal the truth in a way they could never ignore. The street seemed to hold its breath. Shadows deepened. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of footsteps approached, unaware that the game had already changed. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. The morning light barely touched the cracked pavement, painting the neighborhood in pale streaks that barely warmed the cold reality beneath them. I walked slowly down the street, noticing the usual signs, the carefully avoided glances, the hushed conversations that ceased as I passed, the subtle shift in posture when my shadow stretched across the lawns. The world was full of invisible walls, walls built not of bricks but of assumptions, prejudice, and fear. My home, modest and unassuming, sat at the edge of the block. To anyone else, it was just another house with peeling paint and a small garden struggling to thrive. But to some, it had become a symbol of what they could diminish with a glance, a comment, a gesture. For months, the microaggressions had piled up, packages left on the wrong porch, doors closed with a little extra force, cars honking as if I were intruding simply by existing. Each act, small on its own, accumulated into a weight I carried silently, calculatedly, like armor I could never remove. At the corner of the street, I paused. The mailboxes were neatly aligned, some bearing flowers, others clean metal and painted wood. It should have been a place of ordinary routine, a mundane stop on the way to start the day. Instead, it was a battlefield of glances and whispers. Even here, the world reminded me that belonging wasn't optional, it was conditional. I turned back toward the house, heart heavy but mind alert. The pattern had become predictable. Certain neighbors always lingered on the porch when I passed. Certain cars always slowed at the corner. Certain windows always followed my movements. I had watched, observed, documented, and, above all, endured. But patience, as I had learned, has its limits. There comes a point when endurance is not strength. It is silence that allows injustice to fester. In the backyard, the garden had grown wild, not out of neglect but as an unintentional act of rebellion. Flowers pushed through cracked soil, stubborn and persistent, refusing to be constrained. I had planted them with care, watched them grow, and learned their rhythm. In a strange way, the garden mirrored my own journey, quiet, deliberate, and growing despite the obstacles imposed by a world unwilling to fully accept me. I knew that change wouldn't come from confrontation, at least not yet. It would come from strategy, observation, and the subtle, undeniable assertion of presence. The injustice had a rhythm, a pattern, a vulnerability, and if I could read it, I could expose it in a way that was impossible to ignore. The wind shifted, brushing against the walls of the house and rustling the leaves of the garden. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine hummed, a neighbor walking too slowly, a dog barking too sharply. Each sound, each movement, was a note in a symphony of tension that had been building for months. And I knew the day of reckoning wasn't far. The tension didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, like shadows stretching across the walls before dusk. Every morning, I noted the same patterns. the neighbor's eyes flicking toward me, the subtle tightening of doors as I passed, the quiet murmur of conversations that always stopped when I came near. Each action, each glance, carried the weight of unspoken assumptions. They didn't see me, they saw a narrative they had written, one I had no say in. I began documenting everything. Not out of paranoia, but necessity. Notes, photographs, timestamps, a catalog of behaviors that told the true story. The injustice was subtle but consistent. Every minor slight, every whispered joke that stung more than it should, every exclusion from neighborhood gatherings added up to a crescendo I could no longer ignore. The garden became my sanctuary, a place where I could think, where I could plan. Each plant, each flower, growing despite neglect, became a metaphor for resilience. I watched the world around me, tracking movements, memorizing faces, mapping routines. I had learned the rhythm of my street, the patterns of those who thought they could make me invisible. Then the provocations escalated. One afternoon, a car slowed sharply as I walked across the street, blocking my path just long enough to send a message. Another day, a neighbor leaned over the fence, speaking in that condescending tone that implied I had no right to speak, no right to exist. Every act was calculated, every slight deliberate. The emotional toll began to weigh heavier than the physical exertion of navigating the neighborhood. But I was not powerless. Observing their patterns revealed vulnerabilities, the tiniest cracks in their assumed authority. The arrogance of entitlement often comes with predictability. Each action they took, each assumption they made, exposed them to the possibility of being held accountable in a way they never anticipated. I devised a plan, not a plan of violence, but one of exposure and undeniable consequence. It would reveal the pattern, the prejudice, and the injustice they had normalized. Every detail had to be precise, every moment timed perfectly, because the slightest misstep could ruin the message entirely. And so I waited. Days stretched into weeks. Every routine, every predictable action, fed the timing of what was to come. I became a shadow within the neighborhood, quietly observing, calculating, preparing. Each subtle act of injustice they committed became a step in a dance I was choreographing. Then, finally, the day arrived. The moment when the predictable arrogance of entitlement met the undeniable reality of exposure. I watched them move as always, unaware that their assumptions would soon be shattered, that the pattern they relied on so heavily would become the very instrument of their reckoning. The stage was set, the plan in motion, and the story that had been building in silence was ready to unfold. The day arrived with an almost eerie calm, the kind that presses against the chest and whispers that something irreversible is about to happen. The neighborhood seemed ordinary at first glance, children playing on distant sidewalks, cars parked in neat lines, but every shadow felt heavier, every movement deliberate. I had spent weeks, months even, cataloging these patterns, memorizing faces, voices, and routines. Today, all that preparation would collide with reality. It began with the usual signs. Doors closed a fraction too quickly as I passed, glances flickering across fences, whispers halting mid-word. The invisible wall of prejudice that had surrounded me for months shimmered in the sunlight, almost tangible. I could feel it pressing, weighing, daring me to break its rhythm. I stepped into the street, camera in hand, not to film for entertainment, but as documentation, evidence, proof. Every movement I made was deliberate, measured, and timed to intersect with the predictability of those who had been assuming entitlement for so long. I was no longer merely observing, I was orchestrating a revelation. The first target appeared at the end of the block, striding with the casual arrogance of someone who believes rules are optional. The sneer on their face, the self-assured tilt of their head, the assumption in their every step, it was all predictable. My pulse quickened not out of fear, but because the moment of truth was near. I triggered the first subtle effect of my plan. A neighborhood banner, carefully rigged, dropped slowly in the path of their line of sight. Their eyes widened just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty piercing through the confident mask. Then came the next step. Recorded sounds of voices they assumed were private, captured and projected through a hidden speaker along the fence line. Every whispered insult, every hushed comment they had believed was invisible, now echoed clearly, undeniable and public. They froze, confusion flashing across the face, then panic. The realization hit. Their assumptions, their entitlement, their casual disregard had all been documented. Every action, every microaggression, was recorded and now mirrored back in a way they could not escape. And then the visual confirmation, the footage displayed on a discrete screen mounted against the wall of my porch. Faces twisted with recognition as they saw themselves in slow motion, every dismissive glance, every act of subtle prejudice magnified, undeniable. The arrogance that had seemed so untouchable only hours before was crumbling before their eyes. The emotional intensity grew. Neighbors began to peek from windows, drawn by the commotion. They whispered among themselves, some astonished, others nodding in understanding, witnessing the slow, inexorable collapse of the invisible hierarchy that had governed the street. The air was electric with the tension of exposure, each heartbeat echoing the inevitability of consequence. I didn't speak. There was no need. The silence itself became an instrument of judgment. The evidence, curated over weeks, orchestrated precisely to intersect with the arrogance of entitlement, did all the talking. They shifted uneasily, realizing that their power had always been illusory, dependent entirely on the complicity of silence. One figure, the most vocal in enforcing exclusion, stepped forward, attempting to argue, to reclaim authority. But the moment they spoke, a new layer of the plan unfolded, audio recordings of their own statements, juxtaposed against their previous actions, made every defense laughable. The contradiction was undeniable. Even their allies, caught between loyalty and reality, could not deny the truth unfolding. By mid-afternoon, the crescendo was complete. The neighborhood had become a stage, and the players of entitlement and prejudice were exposed fully, stripped of the masks they had relied upon. The reactions were immediate: shame, embarrassment, disbelief, and, for some, a dawning understanding that the assumptions they had made for so long were neither justified nor acceptable. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the climactic moment lingered. It was not explosive in the physical sense, but the emotional impact was seismic. The patterns of injustice, the subtle manipulations, and the repeated microaggressions had all been brought into the light. What had been invisible to most was now undeniable, witnessed by those who had perpetuated it and those who had silently observed. For the first time in months, I walked freely, unburdened by the weight of expectation, prejudice, and assumption. The tension that had built like a storm finally broke, leaving clarity in its wake. The street, once a theater of subtle hostility, had become a place of revelation, and the lesson had been delivered with precision, patience, and undeniable truth. And in that moment, the unspoken question hovered over everyone present: how many more invisible walls exist in this world, and who will have the courage to expose them? The street grew quiet again, but the echoes of the day's revelations lingered in every corner. The arrogance that had once dominated the block had been dismantled, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with precision, observation, and undeniable truth. Those who had assumed entitlement now carried the weight of their own exposure, their invisible walls laid bare for all to see. I walked slowly past the houses, noting the subtle changes. Windows that had once glared now remained closed in thought, doors that had slammed now stayed shut in contemplation. The neighbors whispered quietly among themselves, some shaken, some remorseful, and some finally realizing the reality they had overlooked. Silence and complicity are as powerful as any act of discrimination, and they are just as dangerous. My garden, still wild and persistent, seemed to mirror the transformation. Each flower, each stubborn blade of grass, a symbol of endurance and resilience. It reminded me that even in the face of repeated injustice, life continues, growth persists, and boundaries can be reclaimed. The neighborhood had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a lesson in awareness, accountability, and the cost of assuming unearned authority. By the evening, the tension had dissolved into quiet reflection. Those who had perpetuated subtle prejudice now had to confront themselves, their choices, and the truths they had ignored. It was not a moment of vengeance, it was a moment of clarity, a demonstration that patterns of discrimination and entitlement are never beyond scrutiny, and that accountability can be achieved without malice. As I stood on my porch, the wind brushing against the leaves and the fading light casting long shadows, I understood something essential. Change begins when silence is broken, when injustice is observed, and when patience meets strategy. The world is shaped by those who dare to expose what others try to hide, and even the smallest acts of courage can ripple far beyond the immediate moment. And so, the neighborhood had changed, not overnight, but indelibly. The lesson was clear, the pattern of prejudice disrupted, and the quiet dignity of truth restored. The final thought lingered like a question in the air: how many more silent battles are being fought in streets just like this, and who will have the courage to step forward next?